Hello, I'm Emily Rhodes. Thank you so much for joining me. Today, we're going to be talking about the January pick for Emily's Walking Book Club, which is Brother of the More Famous Jack by Barbara Trapido. First of all, I'm so sorry. I know I sound like death, and I look not quite like death, but not far off. Just had bug after bug after bug this winter, beginning with COVID and sort of moving on to sort of everything. So sorry about that. You'll just have to bear with and enjoy the kind of croaky, husky voice. So, Brother of the More Famous Jack. This was written in the 80s and it's set kind of from the 60s, pretty much kind of up to the 80s, because it covers quite a lot of time. It begins with with Catherine's first encounter with the Goldman family. Now, the Goldmans, I think, exist in two ways. They exist as like individual characters. So there's Jacob, who's the father, Jane, the mother, and then the eldest son, Roger, then Jonathan, then Rosie, then, sort of millions of children. But they also exist as a sort of group entity, the sort of the Goldmans, the force of the Goldmans in their sort of house in Sussex, and with their kind of noisy dinners and sort of chucking garlic bread across the table at each other and swearing like crazy and talking about sex and somehow having these incredibly intellectual conversations that are also unbelievably coarse. And the book opens with this kind of headlong immersion in the world of the Goldmans, and Catherine is completely new to it. She has been picked up by someone who is basically a bit of a pervert. We won't really talk about him that much. And it's this sort of odd coincidence, but he ends up taking her to stay with some friends who transpire to be her university professor, Jake, and his family. And I'll just read you a little bit out, a description of their kitchen, which I think kind of captures their squalor and the sort of allure of that squalor and their kind of general disdain for convention. And I'm just going to warn you that I am going to swear, so sorry. So this is the end of chapter 4. The kitchen is large and dauntingly grotty. There is excess rubbish piling up in a Heinz bean carton beside the overflowing rubbish bin. Where the legs of the table meet the floor, there are encrustations of toddler food. The tops of some homegrown vegetables are wilting on the workboard alongside seeping used tea bags and half-eaten bowls of that morning's cornflakes. It's also perfectly apparent to me that the Goldmans write their telephone messages all over the wall. Alongside the kitchen telephone, the wall looks like a defaced urban street hoarding. Rosie, that's one of the children, has scratched up a conspicuous message in black marker pen for her father. Jake must phone Chris, it says. She's written phone, F-O-N-E, and Chris, C-R-I-S-S. Underneath it, Jacob, the father, has written, if Chris phones me again, and he's used her spelling, tell him to fuck off, and he's put, he spelt fuck, P-H-U-C-K, the P-H from the phone. So it's funny. I mean, this book is so funny. Time and again, I just laughed and laughed and laughed. And I actually laughed out loud, not just a little like, but a real kind of laugh. And I just think that's such a joy when a book gives you that, especially if you're not feeling 100% either physically or emotionally. So, if you want a book that might really make you laugh, I would recommend it. So the Goldmans, we meet them in this kind of quite forceful way, and I would say that not everybody likes the Goldmans. Among the walkers, so we had 65 walkers on Hampstead Heath on Sunday, which was absolutely wild and huge and wonderful. And I think maybe it was because this book holds so much appeal. Most of the walkers did find the Goldmans quite kind of magnetic. there's a great podcast called Sentimental Garbage, and in the episode they did about this, they talked about how they basically like to have sex with like all of the Goldmans, like each one of them. They're so kind of seductive and sexy, and there's so much sex in the book. But some walkers did totally hate the Goldmans. They thought they were so privileged and entitled and loud, and why should we listen to their sort of bantery intellectual conversations? So, you might not like them, but I think you will feel strongly about them, whether that is a strong positive or strong negative. So Catherine goes sort of headlong into this family, and then very cleverly, Barbara Trapido doesn't tell you that much about where Catherine has come from until afterwards, when you get this rather poignant scene with her and her mother. So I'll just read a bit out. This is chapter 14, so quite a way on page 56 here. So she's had this sort of crazy weekend with the Goldmans, and then she comes home. My mother had missed me. That was obvious, and I had not given her a thought. Did you have a nice time? She said. Yes, I said. What did you do? She said. I'm sorry, it's just, this so reminds me of the kind of conversations I have with my children after school, where they don't tell me anything and I ask such rubbish questions. I had been deflowered in a hotel room and had taken blackberries from the hand of a beautiful young man who played the violin and routed the Holy Ghost. I had seen a human placenta and a newborn baby. So yeah, Jane Goldman actually has a baby at home while Catherine is staying. I had learned about crochet hooks and copper clamps in the cervix and egg yolks in the soup. I had found an older woman to emulate and admire in place of my mother. I watched Ava Gardner on the telly, I said. Is that all? She said. I went to the seaside in Brighton, I said. I missed you, she said. My mother gave me a cup of coffee, which I drank on the sofa, staring across at the painting over her fireplace. A painting of a child with Murillo eyes weeping a contrived glass tear. To my mother, this sweatshop Woolworth's oil painting said childhood. I had never been able to compete with its posy guile. I asked myself reproachfully why one glass tear should be more acceptable than another, as I thought of the Goldmans singing Dowland. My mother would go to the ends of the earth if I lay dying, and once did. It was my professor's house, I said, loosening up excitedly. The one who interviewed me. His wife had a baby last night. She had it in the bedroom. It got born in their bed. Between the lines of what I said, my mother read the message. The message was rejection, and it made her hostile. What next? She said tightly. When you get to having a baby, you'll realise the place to have it is in hospital. My mother's house appeared to me confiningly neat and ineptly contrived. She went in for that style of interior decoration which ought, given the evidence, to have induced epilepsy in its profusion of optical effect. A confusion of conflicting patterns on floor and wall. On the floor, autumnal patterned Axminster carpet. Patterned, my mother said, because it wouldn't show the dirt. But since our activities were restricted to those which could not create dirt, there was never any dirt to show. It sort of goes on about that, and there are even sort of, the ducks, the trio of ducks on the wall. And then she ends by saying, it wasn't very polite of you to stay on when you knew the baby was coming. So you can somehow see what Catherine's come from, this very suburban, kind of uptight, claustrophobic life, and, how wild to go from that to the Goldmans. And I think it really makes you feel for Catherine, as part of her, it is really a coming of age story, how she's sort of thrown in there. And, good old Catherine, she answers back, she holds her own. I don't think I would be able to sit at that dinner table with the Goldmans and know what to say while they're all talking so loudly, but Catherine does it really well. As the book goes on, she kind of has this love affair with Roger, which is absolutely horrid and so completely how I remember so many of my teenage infatuations. It's completely inappropriate crush on this sort of horrible boy who hates her for who she is and constantly holds her back to where she's come from. He hates her kind of middle classness, and she is trying to escape that, but he won't really let her. He says things like, while I was playing the violin, you were playing with your earring, or, you were knitting, and you're covering your exercise books with paper. And there's this whole thing about their handwriting, how all the Goldmans have this wild handwriting, really messy, and hers is really neat. And she can't believe that she spent her life making this incredibly neat handwriting with she copies out her essays sort of so that they're extra neat with the nice margin on either side. And the Goldmans just don't do that. She can't believe how illegible Roger's handwriting is. Anyway, she goes off to Rome. Things happen. I don't want to give too much away. And when she comes back, well, let's just say that her relationship with the Goldmans continues in a different way. So it's being compared to a kind of lefty Brideshead Revisited, which I think is amazing for how we really get this feeling of Catherine's infatuation with the whole family. I think that's a really sort of great comparison that can be mined for so many parallels between them. I think also in this relationship between Catherine and the Goldmans, Trapido isn't just telling a coming-of-age story. She's also really looking at gender relations and feminism and sexual politics. Towards the end, Jane, who we meet at the beginning, is this, incredible kind of mother. There she is about to give birth at home while she's like gardening in her wellies in the garden and then creating this incredible lunch. And, effortlessly gets all her children to do washing up for her and their music practice. At the end, she gives Catherine some unwanted advice. She refuses to be silent. She really talks for, several pages in the book. I won't read it all out here. But you suddenly feel how much she's given up and how unhappy she's been and how hard she's worked and how unappreciated it is and how difficult it's been being married to Jake, who essentially is not just a really charismatic, wonderful man, but is actually maybe a bit of a bully. And it really casts a different light on everything that's come before, I think. And she's saying to Catherine, who at this point, well, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that she is married and, going on to the next stage in her life. She's giving her this advice to say, this is what I've learned. This is what you have to do to not end up like me. And it's very shocking, I think, reading this book now. This is the 40-year anniversary. It was 40 years old last year. A long way on from this advice. And it still feels to me like that advice is needed. And that we're still on this point of change, of, the possibility that everything's going to be a bit more equal, but you still have to work really hard to make that happen. So in a lot of ways, this book is very dated. Somebody said it was like Margaret Drabble on steroids. It's kind of very much of the sort of 60s, 70s. There's loads of sex. There's loads of kind of fashion. It's full of that kind of energy from then. But as well as it being such a period piece, it feels incredibly relevant now. So yeah, I would really recommend it. It's a great book to read, especially if you're in need of something a bit energizing and sort of joy-giving and full of life and laughter. Just reaching over for our next book. This is the February book. Very different, very sad, but also sort of peculiarly, incredibly sad, but also slightly, I hesitate to say life-affirming, but there's something in its sadness that makes it a sort of powerful sadness and a good sadness. I'll tell you more about that next month.